First of all, welcome everybody to our TDC virtual salon. I'm Paul Carlos, board member at TDC. To borrow a line from David Letterman, our next guest needs no introduction. Welcome back to the TDC medalist, Paula Scher.
Hi, everybody. I hope nothing breaks. We'll do the best we can. So I wrote a book about an identity project. And the identity project has been going on now for 27 years. I wrote the book in my 25th year after I had done my 25th Shakespeare in the Park identity. And this book really chronicles a life and a time that I lived through doing this project, which I continue to do. And I'm just going to take you right into it. Except for my screen does not move forward. Oh dear.
Are you on a PDF, Paula?
Yeah, I'm on a PDF.
There we go.
It just did. You're looking at a painting of Joe Papp. Joe Papp is the founder of the New York Shakespeare Festival in New York City and the Public Theater. And this painting is by the artist Paul Davis, who did posters for Joe Papp for 19 years. Joe Papp started making Shakespeare performances in New York on a flatbed truck that he took around with actors and actresses and scenery. And he performed them originally in little boroughs, in parks and little boroughs and various areas of New York City. And what ended up happening is it was popularized and people looked forward to it. And the city of New York gave Joe Papp the use of the Delacorte Theater in Central Park to put on annual free Shakespeare productions every summer. This is, if you haven't been here, this is the Delacorte Theater. It sits on a beautiful lake. It's very idyllic and very Shakespearean. And little by little, the plays aren't purely Shakespeare. Sometimes they're influenced by Shakespeare or they are a modern iteration of them. They really run the gamut. And it's really become quite a legend in New York City. In the 60s, Joe Papp saved the Astor Library on Lafayette Street from destruction. This building is around the corner from Cooper Union, and it's a great, industrial age building. And it is the home of the New York Shakespeare Festival and Public Theater in terms of its offices and staff and all the people that work there. And it was a rugged, rough neighborhood when he bought it. Now it's NoHo, probably some of the most expensive real estate in New York City. Joe Papp launched plays that went to Broadway, original Broadway musicals like Hair. And he did, critically acclaimed dramas like Streamers, and the paintings on the right are both done by Paul Davis. And then the first one I saw in the 70s, the Three Penny Opera, which was just a very powerful image and really startling for a play that went to Broadway, because Broadway theater work, as I'll show you, was really rather banal. And this was terrific. At that particular point in time when these things existed, which was probably in the early 70s, I was an art director at CBS Records, and I used to make square covers that were like square posters. As a matter of fact, I loved poster art because it was akin to what I was doing. And I made them for all kinds of things. I made them for stupid bands, I made them for big, important recording artists, and I made them for jazz musicians. I left the record industry in the early 80s and I went on my own. And at that point in time, when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, I began to develop a reputation for something that was called retro design, which was essentially using history to make points, either through typography or through imagery. And probably the most infamous piece of this work was the Swatch watch poster that I designed in 1984 when I first worked on the Swatch account when it came to the United States. At that period in time, most of my work was really influenced by the record industry, which is where I started, and I did a lot of youth culture design. The poster became highly criticized by the end of the decade, and my reputation took a terrible nosedive. And to make matters worse, I was approaching 40, and I found I could no longer really find myself competitive in the youth industry culture. And yet I was a woman at that point. My partner had left during the Bush recession, and I was alone in a business. And I saw that I probably would never grow, that the work I would get would be like the work I had already gotten, but a little bit worse, which is what I call catch 40, and I find not uncommon in design careers. In 1990, while I was running my business, which was called Paula Scher Alone, a guy, a very famous American designer who I admired and was a friend of mine, came to see me. His name was Woody Pirtle, and he invited me to join Pentagram, which I did in 1991. I closed down my business and joined them. I joined an organization where everybody was a man. There were about 20 men and me. I don't remember. Sometimes there were 15, sometimes there were 20. They partners sort of change over the years. It's hard to keep track of all of them. And I look at myself in that picture now, and I can't imagine how I did this. Now I have 3 women partners in New York and 2 more in London, and it's not quite like this. But at that period of time, I felt both intimidated by the men and really impressed with the kind of work they did, particularly in the London office, because they did very influential corporate and institutional identities that you saw in the town immediately. When I went to London, I would see the pharmacy booths, which was everywhere, designed by John McConnell, or I'd see Alan Fletcher's V&A logo, or I'd see all kinds of advertising programs on buses that were done by various partners, and David Hillman's Guardian was everywhere, and it was just amazing. And the New York office of Pentagram at that point was really a growing office. Colin Forbes had founded it in 1978, but it was a very small office until Woody joined in 1998, and he had invited Michael Beirut and me to join at the same time. And then we had Jim Bieber join, who was somebody I knew who was an architect, and the New York office really began to grow. This is a picture of George C. Wolfe. He was the director of the Joseph Papp Public Theater after Joe Papp died. There was somebody in between for a period of 2 years who did not succeed, and George had told me that you couldn't follow Joe Papp, and he knew that whoever took that job right after Joe Papp's death would fail because the board would never get over the fact that that person wasn't Joe Papp. So at the point that George decided to accept the directorship, the theater was already ready to make some kind of change. And George's vision was very populist. He wanted to include all of New York. He wanted to be a place that New Yorkers of every age, every sex, every race, everybody would go to it, and that it would be inclusive to all, and to inspire people and shock them and be entertaining all at once. Now, he hired me because they saw my work in this book that was published in the end of the 80s called Graphic Design New York. And I had bought some pages in it when I still had my old business. And I was also in the book again for Pentagram. But the pages he saw were really a poster of a recording artist and a big hunk of typography sitting there on the page. And he responded to it because it wasn't illustration, it was design. And he realized that type could become image, even though he didn't know how to talk about it. I should tell you that George Wolfe began his career as a set designer before he became a director. As a matter of fact, he used to be able to judge whether or not a play was going to work or not by the opening set. And he made design decisions within the way he directed. So he was very visual. This is what theater advertising looked like then, and to a large degree still looks like now. It's mostly done by agencies. The agencies have accounts with theaters, and they make their money not so much on making the images, but on doing the ad space buys. And if a Broadway show is a big hit, there's lots of money spent on advertising, and you tend to see it everywhere. I didn't want to make anything like this. And I couldn't make anything like Paul Davis because George had asked specifically not to do something different. I had this terrific Rob Roy Kelly book, and at this time I'd also been going to London because I had joined Pentagram. And I walked down an area called Drury Lane on the West End, and I saw that there were theater buildings that were painted with the kind of typography I'm showing you from this Rob Roy Kelly book, the type on the left. And the painted buildings were ads for plays, and they told you who was in the play, the date and time of the thing, and the actors and actresses, maybe, sometimes not. And it was sort of what I would call just the facts man advertising. You put something in somebody's face, you're telling them what it is, you're not insulting their intention or being cloying or mysterious or anything else. Right out there. Then about 2 pages later, down in the book, I saw this construction of typography for American wood type, which I've always loved. And I had seen this 100 times, but I realized that I could create a logo type that was based on these kinds of proportions and that the word would read if I drew the typography correctly. So it dawned on me also that by making different widths of letter forms within a family, it was really sort of an analogy to the breadth of the sort of population that should come to the public theater. When I left CBS Records, I had Haber Typographers, the type company that I worked with, set complete alphabets of all their American wood type collections. They had the Morgan collection, and I had complete alphabets of these things that I Xeroxed all through the 80s and made photostats of and reproduced from, and I had taken them all the way to Pentagram. And at this point, we were computerized, but nothing like this existed digitally left yet. And when I first did the public theater identity, we pasted it together by hand. As a matter of fact, the guy who did this with me, who had worked for me at Paula Scher and was my former student, is a guy named Ron Louie, who later started the first website at the New York Times, and he died of COVID in March 13th. And I look at this, and for me, it's a tribute to Ron and our working relationship. We made lots of things for them, and I hired somebody to go down to the public theater and execute them. And they were really not terribly difficult to do. I mean, they did have to be put together by hand, but the fact of the matter was you were essentially working on a consistent width and whatever the material was, and there was a way for interpreting this stuff. We made t-shirts and complicated advertisements in-house. And then there were a series of handbills that looked like this that were just sort of printed out in one color and were handed out to people as they came in and out of the public theater. And my hope was that there would be this wild amount of this graphics that were around and people would begin to recognize it and understand it as the public. The thing that probably set that in motion was the first Shakespeare in the Park campaign back in the days when they used to buy advertisements on the side of telephone kiosks. And for those of you who are very young, there used to be a telephone kiosk on every other corner in New York City. And there were ads on the side. So if you had one, say, running down Madison Avenue from, the upper end of Broadway all the way down to the Lower East Side, that was fantastic. Everybody knew what was going on. And this is what people saw when the Shakespeare in the Park first changed its identity and began to look at this. And this poster is typical of the kind of copywriting we did for these things. There would be a line, we'd make it up. I'd make it up with George, free will, William Shakespeare, free. And then it has another sort of little private meaning. And then there would be all the names of the plays, no images, because it's almost impossible to find a good image for two completely disparate plays. There was only one time in 25 years I could actually do that. And after that launched, I began designing a series of individual posters, and they were based on the subject matter of the play or the spirit of the play. And George and I were worried about what would happen politically with these posters because managers would want to see them and the actors and actresses would want to see them and they want to have approval and make comments and complain about the photograph. And we thought, oh my God, we don't have time to do that. We don't have the money to do that. So we set a rule, and the rule still holds to this day, is that the work that comes from the public theater is about the public theater. And the actors and actresses don't even get their names on the posters unless it's a one-woman play or something like that. And that neither do any of the management companies who represent these people, and that the notion is that this thing would be very clean and very simple. And it's actually pretty much held to this day. I mean, every now and then there is some political interference, but I found that in comparison to other things I've worked on, it's really very marginal. And it's also become sort of a thing that the actors and actresses accept and don't expect when they come on to do a production there. But you see here, Simpatico had a star-studded cast, and we did put their names on, but they didn't have approval of it. And then Danny Hock was a one-person show, and he had his name on it, but he didn't have an approval over it, and these were the images we made. Unfortunately, with these early posters, we silkscreened them, and they appeared inside the public theater, but there really wasn't any place to put them. We thought they would go on the street, but the police sort of didn't like that because you weren't really allowed to do that. Also, it was quite expensive. It was something that was in those days called sniping, meaning that you would put a pile of posters on the side of a construction barricade. It's actually illegal, but people seem to get away with it. These are some of the posters I did in the first 2 and 3 years. And for the most part, the general public, if they didn't go inside the public theater, never saw these. The people that saw them were the design community, because I used to enter them in things like TDC and in the AIGA and in the Art Directors Club and the Tokyo TDC and every place I could get them into. And they were all over the place. At first, they all got into everything. Then people started getting picky about them. Then people rebelled against them. But for a period of time, they pretty much were coding annuals. After a while, they started to be collected by museums because they were, MoMA had a poster collection and the Cooper Hewitt had a poster collection, and Ellen Lupton featured these in her show called Mixing Messages, which was on graphic design in I think the mid-90s, so that they were seen much more than what the real intent was, and with the wrong community, because the graphic designers that saw them, some of them never set foot in the public theater. Here's one of the posters from this era that actually made it to the street. And then I tried to broaden the language, and sometimes the posters became editorial. Some of them were controversial, but they all used the wood type. What New Yorkers really did see were the Shakespeare in the Park posters, and they were in the subways for a period of time, still on phone kiosks. Then gradually that went away. And what I find wonderful now is there are people who do call me up and want to purchase these or collect them, but the ones that really charm me tell me that they got engaged when Henry the V was playing on, that summer, and they know what summer it was, and they feel completely connected to it when they see it because it touched something in their lives, which is what I wanted these things to do. I wanted the public to engage and connect to them. And sometimes they did. The way people really saw these things were as full-page ads in the New York Times. And of course, that ended after a period of time. Through the 90s, these ran, and then after 9/11, everything got cut, and all of sort of subway advertising changed and became very expensive, so that the not-for-profits were cut out of that expertise, that exercise. And I found that what would happen would be that the Shakespeare posters started to get smaller and smaller also. But each summer we still were doing them, and we also do the train stations that are Metro North and going into New Jersey to Newark. If you entered the public theater from its earliest days, we had to really put the most of the promotion in the lobby. And this is what the public theater lobby looked like. Originally, it didn't look like this. It had marble walls that were kind of a terrible purple color. And the chandelier was quite ornate. And it looked a little like a bordello, if you want to know the truth. And George Wolfe wanted to sort of change the spirit of the whole place. The building architect of the public theater was in those days a guy named Jim Polshek, who had a business called Polshek Partnership, which is an architect firm that later became Ennead. And I didn't know anything about architecture at that time. At that point, I'd been at Pentagram for about 4 years, and my partner, Michael Beirut, had learned to do signage when he worked for Massimo Vignelli. And I didn't know how to read an architect's plan. I didn't know what any of the lingo was. And I remember Jim Polshek saw my identity and said, oh, we got to put this all over the building. We'll paint the walls white. You can hang up your logos and graphics inside the openings to the theater entrances. It'll be great. And then he handed me a rolled up architect's plan, and I looked at drawings that I absolutely did not understand. I didn't understand the difference between looking at something in plan or in elevation, and I thought I was going to cry. And he just assumed I did, and he left because he talked very fast. And I went back to Pentagram and showed the rolled up plans to a woman named Tracy Cameron, who worked for Michael Beirut. And she looked at the plans, and she says, what's your problem? And I said, Jim Polshek wants me to put graphics in the opening of the doorways. And she said, so? And I said, well, how do you do that? She says, you measure the openings and you measure your art and you stick it in the opening. And I said, that's it? And she said, that's it. And from that moment on, I became an environmental graphic designer. I owe Jim Polshek an enormous amount. We redid the public together later, which I'll show you. And because of him, I did a painted building that everybody knows that was the New Jersey Center for Performing Arts. We did Symphony Space together. And to this day, I still work with Anyad, a 25-year relationship. In 1996, I worked on a play called Bring the Noise, Bring the Funk. Originally, it opened at the Public Theater. I first met Savian Glover when he tap danced on the conference room floor at Pentagram, and my partner Peter Harrison photographed him. We didn't know this thing was going to be a monster hit, but it went to Broadway. And most of you know this poster, which was done for the whole season. It was seen. It was sniped around New York City. It was on barricades. It was painted on the side of the building. It used to appear sometimes in the opening of NYC Blue. And on the left-hand side is the result of Peter Harrison's photo session, which was the first poster that appeared in the subway. And the second poster is photographed by Richard Avedon, and that appeared on Broadway and is filled with all the quote ads that are appropriate. The difference is you'll notice that the one on the left has a big public theater logo and the one on the right doesn't. That's because when a public play moved to Broadway, we didn't put the logo on it. We could put in a little P in a circle, but mostly it's the Ambassador Theater that's credited. So what's interesting is the public actually doesn't get that much bounce from having a hit, though they do get money sometimes. We made a lot of things for this play. There was a show book, there were, a CD, there were a lot of, swag and junk. And there was this sort of big, beautiful program that you could purchase if you saw the play, and the program was filled with this sort of wood type that I did for the public theater. At this point in time, we had a version of the font that was digitized sort of badly, and Jonathan Heffler had not yet done the perfect redrawing of Knockout. But later in this period, it would happen. This is what was the billboard on Broadway. It was redrawn on the street. And then Savian Glover, after 2 years, was kicked out of the show because he had a drug problem. So we couldn't show him anymore as a major image, so I just started showing his feet. Then we got a cease and desist letter from the lawyers, his lawyers, saying we can't show any part of Savian Glover, including his feet. So we did a whole series of posters with the bottom of a foot. And I have no idea whose foot that was. At this point in time, I started to really begin to stretch what I was doing with these graphics because people began to imitate them. And it's as if New York City swallowed the public theater's design. This is a play that was in the New York Times, I guess in the late 90s. I don't know quite what year, I don't remember, but that was the logo for the show called Mind Games. It has absolutely nothing to do with the public theater. Also, people began using the wood type to promote plays, even if the logos didn't have wood type. The reason they did that is because the stuff stood out in the New York Times. My former student, Drew Hodges, who founded Spotco, of course, did the best job of it with Chicago. And it's gorgeous. I can't argue with it. And Chicago had a much bigger budget than I did, so he sort of wiped us away. So I changed it. I changed it because the public theater had lost its identity. And what's weird is that it's not great to have your work imitated in that kind of capacity. At first you're flattered by it, but then you realize that the reason you did it is taken away. The place that owned it no longer owns it. Every place else owns it. So I changed it. And I went to George and I said, listen, we have to do something totally different because everything looks like the public theater, so nothing looks like the public theater. And he said, what do you want to do? I said, I want to do something opposite. Maybe I'll do serif typography. And I did these 2 very dark posters and I showed them to him, and I was about to turn 50. And he said, oh dear, you're turning 50. Let's have a year of depressing posters, which we did. Then I got out of it pretty fast. I decided, well, I'll just change the type every season, but we'll do it in the style of the public theater, but it won't be the same face. So by the time somebody does something like it, it will be into the next season. That actually has held pretty true to this day, but this really didn't do the job of it for us because nobody saw the plays, because unless you went to the public theater, you didn't see them. They were in the newspaper and little teeny small space ads in black and white. Sometimes they'd be on a playbill cover, but there was no way you saw this work in mass. So how can you make an identity take hold if nobody actually sees it except for the people that go to that theater? Top Dog Underdog went to Broadway, but they took the public theater logo off of it. And Dog Eaters, I don't even think this poster got printed. A lot of these things existed digitally in one-off things. I mean, I made so many posters that I don't think anybody ever saw at all. During this period, all kinds of crazy things happened. George produced 2 plays that were flops. One was On the Town, and the other one was one called Wild Party that I actually did the Broadway show graphics for that we didn't even open at the public theater. And what happened was that it ate into the endowment, and that there was big political turmoil on the board of the public theater. And some of the theater board left, and the rest of the board decided that George needed a financial director. And they hired a woman, whose name I will not mention, who put herself in the role of just being at war with George Wolfe. So anybody who was a friend of George Wolfe's was on the bad side, and I was one of those people. So she came up to see me somewhere, maybe 6 months after she was working there, and she said, Paul, we're not going to make any more posters anymore. We don't have any money, so I guess you don't have any interest in working for us. So why don't we just that'll be the end of the relationship. And she sort of, in effect, fired me, except for the summer hadn't come. And I said, well, you're going to make the summer poster, aren't you? And she said, well, we'll see. The reality was that she did, but not with me, which is the only summer poster I didn't work on from the time I'd worked here. And then as quickly as you can imagine, she was fired. She was fired by the board because there was such upheaval in general from that tenure. And at this point in time, there was no marketing budget. I mean, they spent very little on advertising and they had nothing to pay me with. So I was in effect not working. George quit in 2 years after she left, and he had another financial manager named Mara Manus who worked with him, and that worked out well. However, we made very few things. I think there were 2 summer posters, and the work of the public became very erratic. There were some in-house art people who were just brought in, and they were working in any old typeface, and you couldn't really tell what was the public theater identity and what wasn't. And then apparently Gail Papp, Joe's Papp's widow, said, can we get that nice lady back who was doing all that work for us for so long? And so they came back and they asked me if I would join the board of the public theater. And I said, okay. They said they wanted me to join the board because they didn't have any money to pay me. So they thought it was a reward by putting me on the board. But going to the board meetings were just work and, to be quite honest, sort of boring. At that point in time, Oscar Eustace became director of the public theater. And he wanted to reinvigorate the place by having a 50th anniversary celebration for the founding of the public theater. So I decided, well, I still had an issue with the typography that I didn't know what to do with. So at this particular point in time, I redrew the public logo in Accidents Grotesque. No one has ever said, hey, did you use Accidents Grotesque on that logo? All you typies out there. No one ever wrote to me about it, but we did. We changed all of the type to Accidents Grotesque for about 2 or 3 years, and then used it like I would use it in public theater form, turned on its side, packed together, very much my style. Sometimes we extended things, and we did this sort of for these very sort of broadly promoted Shakespeare in the Park plays where we bought really good sides of buses, and these were sort of all over town. But I don't think people realized I changed the identity, which I found very surprising. Or maybe they didn't absorb the other identity. I can't tell what happened. Then I pushed it even farther and said, oh, why don't we do it in upper and lower case? I think at this point in time, I've been working with the public for 15 years, and it was the first time I realized that a bust and outdoor poster had the same proportions as Central Park, and you could make a map of Central Park around the thing. So that's what this particular poster was, and it really looks nothing like the others. The worst year was the year that Oscar and Marimans both made decisions on the same Shakespeare in the Park poster, and that was the year I just did millions of comps for it. And the end result wasn't even that good, and the whole experience was frustrating. And I started to wonder what I was doing there. I wasn't really thrilled with the board meetings, and I thought, my God, I don't want to work in this condition, because it was more like any kind of job where you had 2 different clients at war with each other, changing things all the time. And I wasn't being paid for it. So something seemed wrong about the entire relationship. I worked on this poster with Oscar alone, and I actually love this poster. It's again Accidents Grotesque again, with the corners rounded, and we wrote the word free love together. And I really liked Oscar, and I thought this could be a great working relationship. But he didn't hire me; he inherited me, and he called me up and he asked me out to lunch. And I thought, okay, here it comes. He's going to fire me. And I went to lunch with him, and I thought he'd taken me to this incredibly nice Italian restaurant. And I thought, God, he's firing me at a fantastic restaurant. I thought, well, that's really nice. And we were sitting there, and I was waiting for the hammer to come down. And he said, Paula, I always loved the way you designed the public theater when George Wolfe hired you. Can you do that for me again? So he had, in effect, rehired me to do the same job over again. And this is the point where we got rid of theater, and I switched all the typography to knockout, and I began designing for small space ads, because I knew that was the place this stuff was going to be seen. And this launched, I believe, I guess it would be 2008, 2010. I get this whole period mixed up. And these things were successful in one regard. They unified programs at the public theater, so that the different things they didn't look different, and the posters didn't look different. It looked like one identity in one family. There's a problem in that it allows for boredom, because it's difficult to make these things become surprising if they're all the same. We tried to grow it each year with each publication we did. And the Shakespeare in the Park posters, and by the way, this is the only one where I could actually put an image on it, because I could put hair on Hamlet's skull, and that was my first ability to do that. But after the 2nd and 3rd season of this design, particularly in the summer, I thought that they looked quite boring and repetitive, and I even felt that way about the small space ads. So this lasted, I would say, maybe 4 or 5 years. I began adding color to it, which helped, but nobody saw these posters like nobody saw the other original posters. And by this period of time, I felt like these things really were not effective unless the play was a hit, or unless you happen to be going to the public for some other reason. During this period, we began designing the lobby of the public theater. And I was on the board of the public, and I was on the building committee, and we hired Jim Polshek again to be the architect. And one of the people on the board said, I hope you don't think you're going to do the lobby signage because it's a conflict of interest because we get money from New York City and you're on the board. And I said, really? And they said, yeah, you can't design the signage. I said, well, who would design it? They said, well, you'd have to find another designer. And he said, you want me to hire another designer to do the signage in the lobby? And I have to walk in for the rest of my life and see that signage there? I said, no way. And they said, well, you can't do it on the board. So I quit the board. And they never understood why I would feel that way. They were just so shocked that somebody would leave the board to do, some dumb work like design signage for the lobby of the public theater. But I loved working on it. It was great. We hired Ben Rubin to do this chandelier, which projects all of Shakespeare's plays. We incised typography into the building arches, around corners. There was a red fence that went around the lobby. Here's the donor's wall. And here behind the box office were just a pistache of so many of the posters I worked on over the years that were attached to the wall. And I looked at it. I remember thinking, this really belongs here because that's where posters belong. I mean, they were a thing of the past. Most everything was moving to some form of digital communication. And there were going to be screens in the lobby, which we had designed, and you knew that this was not a necessary form of the communication. It wasn't even seen that much. At this particular point in time, I think 2 years earlier, I had a woman who worked for me named Kirsten Huber, and I sent her down to the public theater, and she began an in-house art department, and it began to become serious. She began hiring good people, and more of the work could be done downtown. The season that the lobby opened, we had also done a campaign that related to the architecture because it had a red band like the red fence in the lobby. Here's some of the graphics on the awning. And this was the first campaign we did, and it was really an advertising campaign. I mean, it had complete recognizability. It had a sort of a style of writing to it. It had images that were put together in a specific way. It was on the last of the phone kiosks. It was in the subway, and it was in the subway cars. As a matter of fact, there was more promotion on this than normal. And Kirsten helped me with a lot of the interior things. And then the following season, we worked on this poster, and we decided that it would be just a very, very different feeling from the other posters. And we wanted to see if we could extend the graphics of this poster in some way that it had more of a bounce to it. And it would have as much traction as the advertising campaign we'd done the year before. So we began designing other things with it, and Kirsten used it for Joe's Pub, which had been at the Public, I think, for maybe 6 years prior to this, and they had a previous identity, and Joe's Pub looked nothing like the Public and looked like a mess. And Joe's Pub is on the side of the Public Theater, but when the lobby was renovated, Joe's Pub began to join the Public Theater, so the two became joined. And therefore, it was another opportunity to make more graphics for something so it would make this recognizable. The other thing that was an innovation that year was putting up signs at the Delacorte and designing them in the style of the graphic for the year. So it meant that the public had witnessed something that might be recognizable. And of course, we used knockout on everything, but the way we handle the knockout would change very much more strongly season to season. The following year, we finally figured it out. We did a poster for Comedy of Errors and Love's Labor Lost, and it had this sort of overlapping see-through colors. And if you'll notice, there's a yellow outline around the letter forms. And the thinking here, which holds to this day, is that the summer poster is a new identity, and that identity could become a manual for an entire season. And that whatever the spirit of that poster is, or color system, or something about it, could be applied to virtually everything that was made at the Public, which at this point was quite extensive, because there was the plays, there was Joe's Pub, there was Under the Radar, there were a number of other programs. There's something called New Work Now. And there were all kinds of audiences that were coming to the public for various things. So it meant that the physical identity would have a much broader reach. So here are the signs we did for the Delacorte. Other posters that were done in that style, the buses. And then we used it as the manual. And as you can see here, in terms of this demonstration, is really what you're doing is taking what existed in the poster and analyzing it. In this instance, we were flopping it, but the yellow line became a blue line, and the yellow became a second color, and the red became the predominant color, so that you would get a season of posters where the whole thing had a complete look, where you would see whether it was Joe's Pub or the season posters or more advertising, that this thing would really hang together. The next season, we did the skewed type design. And the skewed type design had wonderful legs because you could just build out lists of names and various things that went with it. And then we changed it. We got rid of the green color when we did the got rid of the summer season because it just didn't really look that good. So you can correct your mistake within it. But the problem here was there's still a disconnect between the summer and the season plays. As a matter of fact, if you look at this season and you look on the right side and you read down, you're going to see a little play called Hamilton. And there it is in a list of everything, like they're all equivalent. But that was the point of the public, that in thinking of it, they are all equivalent. They're all supposed to be great or interesting or something. And Hamilton went to Broadway, and I think the graphic was done by Swatco, has nothing to do with the downtown production, and it's nothing like the public theater. Later, I found that people inside the theater give these things names. Like there's, I think, the skewed one, and there's the, I don't know, there's the slashy one. And apparently people refer to what season they played in at the public by what the graphic is, which charmed the hell out of me, because that's really what you want an identity to do. You want people to recognize it and refer to it and have an understanding that this is a place and sort of understand the game of the place, what happens with it. And that each season it would change. It would be like introducing a new identity for the season, except the parameters were that whatever was the season went away at the end. And then the next Shakespeare in the Park introduced what the new identity would look like. This one, like the guys called the slashy one. This is where I just broke through type and we were cutting through everything. It's one of my favorites, actually, and it looks like it was easy to do, but it wasn't. And there's a terrific team now at the public. There's a woman named Tammy Schell who's the main art director, and it seems that they pick these things up so fast and they improve upon them, that they get better as the staff works on them. And they really, by the end of the season, I think they're probably sick of it. But the fact of the matter is they really get to learn how these things work. And it's like getting a new pair of eyes each season. And these things go on and on. If you saw the abstract movie that Netflix did, the documentary, we were working on this, and the woman in the film is Kirsten Hoover, who was the art director at the time we did this. And this thing, at the point we did this, I mean, everybody seemed to recognize these things faster. They knew it was the summer season. They knew it wasn't a new identity for the public anymore. And I began to feel pretty confident about the direction. But this was the direction where I knew I had done what I wanted to do. This was a season where we did a lot of plays for one production, which was Julius Caesar. And Oscar had directed this play, and it was very political. And he had, I think it came out in 2016 after Donald Trump was elected, and he had Julius Caesar dressed up in a business suit with a haircut like Donald Trump. And it was critical of Trump, and Delta Airlines, which was a sponsor of the public, decided that they didn't want to sponsor the public anymore because it was getting criticism for being mean to Donald Trumpsy. And then JetBlue came in and picked up the sponsorship and saved the day. And they probably got more press from this than they typically got for a Shakespeare performance. But the fact of the matter was that when they went to do the story on the front page of the Daily News, they didn't use an actor, they didn't use an actress, they didn't use the director, they used the poster. And that I knew I had finally seeped into the public conscience, because you would look for the most familiar thing you could find to do this, and there it was. So they've been growing, and they are different every year. And I don't get tired of doing them because I get to reinvent them. And I love the way the staff extends them. I think it's amazing. I look at them on my iPhone. Sometimes I say move it to the left. Mostly it's just great. To see an identity move and grow and change. And that the fact of the matter is, we're sort of lying when we say to our clients, oh, yes, this identity is going to last you for, there's no way you know how long an identity can last. There's no way you can make that prediction. You have to kind of live with it and grow with it. There's no way I could have predicted what would have happened with digital media. There's no way I could know what was going to happen with different economies. And there's no way you can know what's going to happen with public taste. And I had my partner, Alan Fletcher, one of the men in that picture, I assume, said a long time ago that people who work in any kind of field where you invent something, usually that business will invest 25% of their profits in research and development. And graphic designers don't. Graphic designers take their fees and then go on to the next project. But the public theater was my R&D, and that some of the things I did, I love. Some of the things I did, I think may have been failures. I'm critical of the work. I learned from the work. It has been an amazing thing to do. And here it is in its smallest form and just pulled off Instagram. And I know that this is a great thing, and I want to stay with it as long as I can. And I wrote the book, and it's got posters in it that pull out, and lots of spreads and color, and really everything I showed you and told you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for that, Paula. Do you have time to answer a few questions?
Sure.
Sure. Okay, great. So we have a question from Lucy Thompson. How do you stay inspired? You've been working for 40, 50 years.
Who's counting?
That's why I rounded it.
Actually, it's close to 50 years. Really.
Yeah.
I started working, my first job was probably in 1970. So it's 50 years. I love to make things, and I love to think I can do something better than I've already done it. I think when I stop thinking that I can't do it better than I already did it, I'll give it up.
Do you have any advice? There's a lot of students watching this. Do you have two pieces of advice, or just even one piece of advice as they look at your work, other designers' work? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, I can give them some business advice. How is that?
That's good.
Okay. Don't take jobs for the money when you're starting out. Take them for what you can learn and what you can make. It's very important, because when you put yourself in a position where you're letting the monetary side rule the process, you won't be able to take the chances and do the experimenting you need to grow as a designer. And the money will come later. And that I really urge young people to think in that direction. I see too many of them trapped in jobs where they're just earning a living.
Okay. Question from Rachel Veitch. When you first started your career, what were some challenges you faced as a woman? Do you find yourself facing new challenges, or does your reputation speak for itself most of the time now?
Well, I very often I meet people who don't know my total reputation. It's easier now. there's no question, but then also there's a preconception about what I'm going to do, and that makes it difficult. I would say that I found a lot of challenges initially in the music industry as a woman in the 70s, and I didn't. There was a women's movement, but it seemed to be about something else. It didn't really talk about the subtleties of the behavior, which hadn't been defined yet. Like things like mansplaining were never categorized in the 1970s. In the 70s, it was much more overt than that. You were really surviving people touching and grabbing. It was beyond Me Too. You know, that sort of thing was part of the natural behavior, especially in the music industry. And I was what I would describe at that period of time as a smart ass, and I would clip my way out of a situation, or I would make jokes with them to get the behavior to go away. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And I found that the most important thing was to be good at my work, because that was the great safeguard. My mother, who was a school teacher, taught 9th grade civics. And I felt that if she had been born in my generation, she would have been a lawyer. But being a school teacher was probably the best she could aspire to at that period of time, and never had any difficulty in it because everybody thought women made great school teachers. I wanted to make people think that women made great graphic designers. That was my way of commenting.
Great, thank you for that. So how do you get over the stuff you don't like? You talked about one season that you didn't like those posters anymore. How do you get over that? How do you start a new season with the public theater? Do they give you a brief? Do you sit down with the directors and discuss options? And how many sort of iterations do you do till you get to that point where you say this is the one?
I
There's
hate
a lot
to
of
admit
questions there.
I don't do anything that hard. that hard I would not do for free. What Oscar and I usually get on a phone call somewhere between January and March. Usually the call gets postponed 15 times. And what he does is tells me what the season is going to be and how he thinks it's going to feel. And it usually emanates from the 2 plays he's doing that summer. And I'll generally, we'll write language for it. It'll be, sometimes he writes the language. Generally, like a lot of times he finds a Shakespeare quote that's too long, that just doesn't look good on the poster, and I'll change it back and forth. And we sort of, talk about that. And it's not that difficult because we're pretty much in agreement on most things. And this past season, which unfortunately can't make it into the book because it's too late, I love. And it was the first time there wasn't a Shakespeare in the Park production because COVID hit and they didn't release the posters. And now if you go online, you'll see the season. If you go to the Pentagram website, you can see a big outpouring of it. And I love the way the in-house art department is making the pieces for it. I think it's really lively and fresh. This season was Stencils, because I'd never done stencil type before. And I tried a number of iterations with his quote, and none of them worked. I never showed them to him. What I showed him was a simplification of a quote, and then he wanted to change the language, and then I think the language changed the 3rd time. But the look of the poster was set pretty much on that first thing I showed him. I also show the marketing director, Tom McCann, and he sees it and Oscar sees it, but Oscar is the guy who has to say about it. And then, sometimes there's an argument that the language isn't right, but on the visuals, not very much change.
Does it help to be a good writer, copywriter, to be a good designer, at least with this kind of work then?
It helps to understand and appreciate copy just to be a good designer.
Okay.
I mean, so much of what we do, whether it's designing promotion pieces or doing editorial work in any capacity, is putting emphasis on language. You're deciding what's big, what's little, you know, how do you play a scale? What's decorative? What's depressed? You know, like what do you do? What do you do with the text? How should that feel? Where does this stuff go? How does somebody confront it? I mean, all those things matter. So the words matter.
Good point. And maybe the last question for this afternoon. I know you mentioned your partners as being a point of inspiration when you joined Pentagram, and obviously, you know, your current partners as well. Are there other designers or artists that you admire and appreciate that people should be looking at, or unknown designers or less well-known designers?
Oh God, there's some. I think I wish I could rattle them off, but I think this is the best era of typographic design in my life. And I think that the people who are drawing fonts and making typefaces are great. You know, I love Heinrich Kubel and A2 is a type business. I like Peter Bielak in the Netherlands, who I think is just a genius. I love all of the people I've seen come out of Type at Cooper, which I think does such a great job. A lot of my people who work for me have gone there now. It is tremendously exciting. I work a lot with Jeremy Mickle, who's redrawn and drawn faces for me that are beautiful. I mean, that's where I'm most impressed. And then the graphic designers are the usual suspects, and there's always somebody up and coming. I'm blessed with spectacular partners at Pentagram, all of whom inspire me, and my husband Seymour Quast and his friends, and my friend Louise Feely. I mean, it's all part of the community that you know, and then there are younger people coming on to it all the time. But I have to say that the breakthroughs in typography have been astounding.
Great. So thank you very much, Paula, for taking the time for this talk.
Oh, I'd like to say just one thing. I'd just like to thank Paula for everything she does, and for the Type Directors Club. You've been a great friend, and we always appreciate everything you do. So thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, audience. We'll see you at our next event, November 12th. Thank you, Paula.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.